Hello, it's been a while since I've made a video and I want to tackle three topics real fast. The first is Project Cactus. Second, I'm doing what I'm calling mini book reports. And then the third thing, there was some news released about what Baldur's Gate 3, and so I wanted to just talk a little bit about early access for games. Throughout this, especially for the mini book report part, I'm going to try and be clear when I'm quoting something while I'm talking, but I'll post an as-written transcript for clarity to hopefully make sure that there's no quotes that get confused. Project Cactus, really quick. Last week I planted a whole bunch of cactus seeds, and probably another 2 weeks or so before they start to germinate. It's a long process, apparently. So, anyway, the mini book reports are basically, as I'm reading some things that are harder than others, I need to take some time to really think it through. So right now I'm reading Simone de Beauvoir's Ethics of Ambiguity. And so to set the stage, Being in Nothingness by Sartre, published in 1943-ish. A year before that, Camus published Myth of Sisyphus. So Ethics of Ambiguity, published 1947. Existentialism has been at least being published about for probably, since there's stuff before and after, let's say about a decade or so by this point. So it's not breaking new ground in the sense of it's a bold new philosophical outlook, but it's more refining an argument and taking on a new way of looking at the world of existentialism here. First chapter is what we're going to tackle today. It's entitled Ambiguity and Freedom. If you're not familiar with philosophy books, they're usually long-form arguments, and so you really need to spend a lot of time at the beginning to understand the groundwork, or you're not going to get much out of the rest of the book. So, as a fun fact, my version's copyright page has a quote from Montaigne, who was a French Renaissance-era philosopher. The quote is, life in itself is neither good nor evil. It is the place of good and evil according to what you make it. That's a much more cheerful take from Montaigne compared to the quote from him that Beauvoir starts the book with. She starts with, "The continuous work of our life is to build death." As an aside, Montaigne also said, "The most certain sign of wisdom is cheerfulness," which I like as a counterpoint to this more dreadful and dreary view most people have of existential style philosophy. Montaigne probably isn't technically an existentialist, being, French Renaissance era philosopher, but I'm going to qualify him in with Charlie Brown and me as sort of a cheerful existentialist if you just look at just these three quotes in isolation and don't read anything else by him. Anyway, back to Beauvoir and the other existentialists. It's key, and you see it in those quotes here. Good and evil aren't inherent to the world like you might see in in other philosophies, right? Rather, they see that good and evil are the outcome of human action and decision. And that's going to get clearer when we get to the end. And even that's kind of a muddy, rough squint while you're looking at it to really get it. Now, I'm not saying that you have to agree with this philosophy. In fact, most people probably won't. But if you want to learn about something, you have to understand the underpinnings of the argument being made. So even if you don't agree with that, even if you think there are some things that are inherently good or inherently evil, you have to understand that that's what is being meant here in the argument being made, or, nothing good can come of it, like, Marley being dead. You've got to know that. You've got to accept this, or the rest of this isn't going to make sense. So, to further understand it, we're going to do something that I love to do. Define our relevant terms. So, existentialism is a philosophy about how man acts and is acted upon by reality, which will be one of our terms. We'll also need to define the two terms in the book's title, ambiguity and ethics. Finally, Chapter 1 is entitled Ambiguity and Freedom, so we're obviously going to define freedom as well. And we're going to basically take it in that order, except we'll swap freedom and ethics because you need to understand the first set of terms to be able to really work in and understand what Beauvoir means by ethics. Reality is actually super simple to define. Beauvoir has a variant in here on one of my favorite Sartre quotes. Sartre says essentially, reality exists, like it was in one of the many debates in where he was having with other philosophers, and they asked him, how do you know reality exists? And he's just like, reality exists. You accept that. And here Beauvoir says essentially, man exists. If you can't accept that man or reality exist, you can't really get much further in existentialism. You've got to accept those two facts, or you're not getting anywhere. So she expands on this fact that man exists, stating that we're not questioning or wondering whether man's presence in the world is useful. Existentialism isn't a philosophy about, hey, how useful is man to the world, right? This isn't what it's about. It's not even really truly a question about whether life is worth the trouble of being lived. That's sort of answered. Camus goes into it in The Myth of Sisyphus. What's his quote? Something along the lines of, the biggest question in philosophy is whether or not one should commit suicide, right? He's basically saying, why do we exist? Well, he answers that, go read Myth of Sisyphus. Point is, she's saying, my argument here isn't about whether or not we should be troubled with living or not. What's important, she says, essentially, is how does a person want to live, and under what conditions does this person want to live? So in short, this argument is sort of saying the world exists, choose how to deal with it, and that's reality in the world of the ethics of ambiguity. Now, ambiguity has a lot of meanings, and here Beauvoir is not using it to mean, I don't know what you're talking about, I need clarity, but to mean, I've not yet decided what this will become. Think less squinting down to see the end of the road, or trying to, look at someone's face and remember where you've seen them, and more an artist sitting in front of a blank slate trying to decide what to create. You know what? I do have a quote for this. Let me see. There it is. She says that what she's talking about is the non-temporal truth of man's existence. The past, she says, which no longer is, and the future, which is not yet. That moment when man exists is nothing, because again, it doesn't exist in the past, not the future. This is what she calls tragic ambiguity, right? Here's where an individual is an object that is interacting with reality and other objects, and that person doesn't know how they're going to respond in the moment, and we have to come to terms with how we're going to do that. That's the ambiguity, right? It's looking truth in the face, as she says, and saying, you can't state that our earthly destiny has or doesn't have importance, because it just doesn't, right? Reality exists, man exists. You have to decide what that importance is. It depends upon us to give it, reality, earthly destiny, importance. So that's what the ambiguity is. We don't have a meaning unless we give meaning to all of these things. And not knowing that meaning is where ambiguity comes in. Freedom is the next term, and it comes from understanding how man interacts with reality under this haze of ambiguity. There's a few points where she sort of comes back to this point, and one of the most direct of the quotes is, existence asserts itself as an absolute, which must seek its justification within itself and not suppress itself, even though it may be lost by preserving itself. Man must not attempt to dispel the ambiguity of his being, but on the contrary, accept the task of realizing it. That's pretty heavy, but think of the same time in Being and Nothingness where Sartre says, oh, well, if you're going somewhere and the road's blocked, your only choice isn't just to turn around and go home. You have all sorts of other choices. You could try and find another path. You could jump off the mountain, because Sartre tends to use these sorts of examples just to show that you have choices. And so that's what she means by you can't suppress the absolute fact that you have these choices, even though you may lose some of yourself by preserving some of these choices. And that's where, like, if you look back, what was it, like 4 months now ago, where we talked about existentialism again, it comes full circle here. You're free to choose your fate, but you have to embrace that freedom. Uh, I think both Beauvoir and Sartre, and probably Camus in one of his other writings besides The Myth of Sisyphus, it may even be in there, say that even choosing to say, hey, no, I don't agree with this, is you freely rejecting it, and that's still a human choice made freely of your own free will. So freedom is accepting the ambiguity that surrounds reality and deciding, screw it, we're still going to have to make a choice. She basically says the source of all our values resides in the freedom of men, which brings us to ethics. Now, ethics is a super complicated subject written about since I think the dawn of history. Probably even before that, people were trying to figure out what are ethics, how is one ethical. We're not going to try and discuss in this like mini book report here ethics on a grand scope. We're going to try and define it as loosely as needed to fit into what Beauvoir here is talking about. In this case, ethics are the values you choose to embrace and prioritize with using freedom to act with using your own free choice. She adds a lot more steps if you actually go read chapter 1, and it's hopefully a little bit clearer, and she goes into a little more nuance here and there. But morality is basically an adhesion to the self, is how she puts it. And she makes sure to state this isn't a positive will like you might see in Kant. It's not, man is good or any of that. Here, she does say that there is a good and evil, but it's not in the sense where we think like murder bad, saving puppies good. It's more a moral freedom, right? And evil is the rejecting of that freedom, or the notion of reality and the notion that you are responsible for your choices. So it's not a cosmic good and evil in the sense of, making the world a better or worse place. It's a framework of the self. So this, she says, is why you can have ethics and existentialism, because you can define, your world, your goods and your evils, right? A good thing is accepting responsibility. A bad thing is the rejection of the self-will. And the important thing is that these evils, she says, aren't like evils you'll see in other philosophies, where evil is a logical error, like, oh, you should know stealing is wrong, and so that's really like a philosophy that has that. It's very hard to get to evil, right? Because everyone knows that's wrong. You're just choosing to be bad. That's a weird ethics. But it's also not like a humanitarian sort of ethics, right? Where humanitarian may not have been the right word. But think of Aquinas, who says many moral failings are caused by misordering goods. For example, personal pleasure, to some degree, is a good. But if you put it above, say, the rights of others and you steal, you had two competing goods. You chose the lesser good, and by doing that, you did something evil. Or, so it's not, she's not saying it's like that sort of morality either, where there's some sort of scale that you can weigh out and decide, what's good, what's evil. Likewise, it's not utilitarianism, right? It's not like, I forget who it was, but someone who's like, well, what if we just base everything on what makes the most net good? And, so maybe giving that guy $5 doesn't really do anything, but giving the homeless guy $5 is a better good. It's not even saying that. It's got nothing to do with any of that. It's about the creation of one's own moral framework. So the evil here again is an ethical failing of man, but to reject their responsibility and freedom, or to not accept that responsibility. Again, this is a very big oversimplification, but I guess the last time I'll repeat this to make it clear. The ethics we're talking about here are not of a prescribed variety, right? We're not talking like 10 Commandments style of ethics. This is a more philosophical view of your ethics are something that are a creation of yourself, and you need to take responsibility for that. Again, you don't have to agree with that philosophy, but we're not going to get anywhere in trying to understand the rest of the ethics of ambiguity if we don't understand what Beauvoir means by ethics. And again, this is quick, dirty sort of view of it. If you read the first chapter, you'll probably come away with a more nuanced, better view. But again, those are our four terms. Very quickly again, reality, it exists. Deal with it. Ambiguity, we don't know what our choices are going to do. We have no real defined framework to work in, and therefore we have this temporal and tragic ambiguity where we have to make decisions in, which is where freedom comes in. You're free to choose, but you have to accept the responsibility of your choices and understand that's it. You're making these choices. And ethics is essentially the combination of those 3 points. It's, hey, you understand that you've got to choose in a world where things actually happen and matter. You're not just choosing something in some abstract unreality. And you're choosing. No one else is choosing, and you can't have perfect knowledge. And even if you did, you can't be sure of it. So whatever choice you make, you got to live with the decision you make. And no one else can tell you what those things are. There we go. Probably could have saved you like 10 minutes if I just said that. All of that ties back to that Montaigne quote we have on the inside cover. The world has no set ethical or moral framework in existentialism. You can disagree with that all you want, but for this argument, no set ethical or moral framework beyond that the self has to choose its own ethics. So that, I think, if you get through all of that, is the basics of the ethics of ambiguity. Figuring out how you want to approach this is where you create your ethics, and that's where Beauvoir is going to leave us for chapter 1, and then we're going to start talking about personal freedom in the next chapter, which I haven't started reading yet, so not exactly sure what that means. Alright, that's all the heavy stuff. Philosophy, very heavy, whatever. Here, very quickly, let's talk about something that is just fun. Baldur's Gate 3, Larian Studios announced that their early access period gonna basically require a buy-in of the full complete game, which is happening more and more now. Mattering on how old you are, you may remember when getting into a beta or alpha was sort of a fun thing. You'd submit your computer specs to a website, and you'd wait for waves and keys to go out. It was like winning the lottery, right? You'd sign some silly NDA that you'd really only half read, and then you would basically go in and try and break the game in whatever silly way you could. But that's really not what early access is anymore, and even the Larian folks, I forget who said it, they're calling this a playable pre-order now, and so they understand that it's not like it was, 15 years ago. So this change makes sense, right? Because studios are asking you to pay them to beta test their products now. I get it. Games are a lot more expensive to make now. People will do it. There's a market for it, right? There are going to be people, and a sizable number of them, who are going to pay to get into the early access, and it's going to make for a better product, right? In the end. And also, the Larian studio team is what? Let's be generous, and let's say they had 100 people. They don't. They're probably a smaller studio than that. They're not going to find everything that people, hundreds and thousands of paid early access, are going to find. Like, if you look at Pathfinder Kingmaker, right? That was a game that was released with a lot of testing and loads and loads of bugs. So the more people you have in your playable pre-order, the more bugs you can squash before general release. Which leads to this weird, how do you review a game for people who do that? Do I base it on the pre-order? Because they're saying it's not complete, so is it wrong to ding them for incomplete bugs in the pre-order? Do I need to wait for it to be released? And waiting for it to be released, like, who knows how long that could be? There are going to be people who have played this, 25-hour pre-order dozens of times by the time it's released. There are going to be people who have played the game into the ground and seen everything there is to see, except for all of the stuff that gets released after. So again, no real thesis here. I'm not really trying to explain anything. Just kind of a fun, maybe not fun, but an interesting way that early access has changed over the last 15 years. My last point though about this early access is, again, I mentioned what they said, it's like 25 hours, 3 major zones. In any game genre besides the JRPG or the CRPG, you tack on maybe another 5 hours of gameplay, you're talking about a complete game there. The early access for almost any game that wasn't a Baldur's Gate like, or a Final Fantasy, or a game in those veins, that like 25 to 30 hour gameplay, that would be a complete game that is being in this early access pre-order. That's, again, weird just to think about. But anyway, that's all I really wanted to talk about. Wait, there was one more thing. I think last year there was. I should have pulled this up before I started talking. Um, Last year, well, it doesn't matter because I can't find it quickly or easily. But anyway, I hope everyone has a good rest of the day. I think it's Sunday now, so happy Labor Day, and everyone, I hope you take care. Have a good day. Bye.